There is a quiet kind of loneliness that follows you, even in crowded rooms, a loneliness that doesn't announce itself with tears or chaos, but settles deep inside your chest, heavy and familiar, and it comes from being surrounded by people who know your name, recognize your face, celebrate your milestones, and still never truly see you, because being seen is not about being noticed. It's about being understood. And for most of my life, I learned how to survive without that understanding, how to adapt, how to become whatever version of myself the moment required, smiling when I was expected to smile, speaking when silence felt safer, staying silent when my truth felt inconvenient, and slowly, almost without realizing it, I buried the parts of me that didn't fit neatly into other people's expectations, because the world rewards the version of you that is easy to digest and quietly ignores the one that is complex, conflicted, and still searching. And so I became skilled at performing rather than existing, at presenting rather than revealing, at being fine, even when I was unraveling inside. And the strange thing is that people praised me for it. They admired my strength, my calm, my consistency, never realizing that what they called strength was often just endurance, what they called calm was restraint, and what they called confidence was sometimes nothing more than exhaustion wearing a convincing mask. And over time, I stopped expecting anyone to look deeper, because expecting to be seen felt like setting myself up for disappointment. And disappointment has a way of teaching you to lower your hopes quietly, without protest, without drama, until one day you realize you no longer ask to be understood, you simply accept being tolerated. And that acceptance slowly shapes how you see yourself, making you question whether your deeper thoughts, your fears, your contradictions are even worth sharing. And so you learn to keep them private, locked away behind humor, productivity, ambition, or silence. And you convince yourself that this is maturity, that this is independence, that needing to be seen is weakness. But the truth is, the human soul is not built to be invisible. It craves recognition, not for validation, but for connection. And denying that need doesn't make you stronger. It only makes you quieter, more distant, more alone in ways that are hard to explain. And I carried that quiet loneliness with me through different phases of my life, through success and failure, through friendships and relationships, through moments where everything looked fine from the outside, because loneliness doesn't disappear when things are going well. It just becomes harder to talk about. And then one day, without warning, there was a shift, subtle but undeniable, when someone didn't just listen to my words, but paid attention to the spaces between them, to the pauses, to the way my voice changed when I spoke about certain things, to the way my eyes avoided certain truths. And it unsettled me at first, because being seen after a lifetime of being overlooked feels intrusive before it feels comforting. It challenges the identity you've built around self-reliance and emotional control. And suddenly the walls you spent years constructing don't seem as solid, because this person didn't ask me to explain myself. They didn't demand vulnerability. They didn't force their way in. They simply noticed. And noticing is powerful, because it says, I see you even when you're trying not to be seen. And that kind of attention is rare in a world that listens only long enough to respond, not long enough to understand. And what surprised me most was that this person didn't romanticize my struggles or try to fix them. They didn't offer cliches or solutions. They didn't reduce my complexity into something manageable. They allowed me to be unfinished, uncertain, and human. That permission felt unfamiliar, almost uncomfortable, because I had grown used to being valued for what I provided, what I achieved, how I performed, not for who I was beneath all of that. And slowly, without grand conversations or dramatic confessions, something began to change inside me, because when someone sees you clearly, you start seeing yourself more honestly. And I began to notice how much energy I had spent hiding, how much of my life had been shaped by the fear of being misunderstood, and how heavy that fear had become. And I realized that the most exhausting thing I had ever done was pretending that being unseen didn't hurt. Because it does, it leaves marks you don't always recognize until someone treats you with genuine understanding and you feel the contrast. And in that contrast, you see how starved you've been, not for attention, but for recognition. And that's when it became clear to me that this person wasn't special because they were perfect or extraordinary. They were special because they were present, because they chose curiosity over assumption, empathy over judgment, patience over control. And in a world that moves fast and listens shallowly, that choice is rare, and it changed something fundamental in me because for the first time I felt like I didn't have to translate myself. I didn't have to simplify my thoughts or hide my contradictions. I didn't have to be palatable or impressive. I could just exist. And that existence felt lighter, freer, and more honest than anything I had experienced before. And it taught me something I wish I had learned earlier, that being truly seen by even one person can undo years of silent loneliness, not by erasing your pain, but by sharing the weight of it. And as I stood in that realization, I understood that this wasn't just about them seeing me. It was about me finally allowing myself to be seen, which might be the hardest and bravest thing any of us ever do. What I didn't realize at first was how deeply being seen would unsettle me, because when someone recognizes parts of you that you've spent years avoiding, it doesn't feel like comfort right away. It feels like exposure, like standing under a light that reveals both your strengths and the fractures you learned to hide so well. And there were moments when I wanted to pull back, to retreat into the familiar safety of being unreadable, because invisibility had become a form of control for me. Way to decide how much of myself the world was allowed to touch, and yet this person never pushed, never demanded access, never treated my guardedness as something to conk. They simply stayed steady and observant. And that steadiness was what slowly dismantled my defenses, because defenses are built for conflict, not for patience. And I began to notice how differently I behaved around them, how my words came out less rehearsed, how my silences felt less pressured, how I didn't rush to fill every pause with productivity or humor. And it was unsettling to realize how much of my personality elsewhere was shaped by the need to be perceived a certain way, competent, strong, composed, useful, while here I could be uncertain without being diminished, quiet without being dismissed, flawed without being judged. And that contrast forced me to confront a difficult truth about myself, that I had confused being independent with being emotionally inaccessible, that I had mistaken self-sufficiency for self-erasure, and that in trying so hard not to need anyone, I had deprived myself of one of the most human experiences there is, mutual understanding. And the more I became aware of this, the more I noticed how rarely people truly see each other, how often conversations are performances, how quickly we jump to conclusions, how eager we are to label rather than listen. And I realized that this person's ability to see me wasn't magic. It was intention. They paid attention in a world that rewards distraction. And that intention created a space where I could finally stop bracing myself. Because when you've lived unseen for a long time, you develop a constant readiness for misunderstanding, a habit of preemptively explaining yourself, justifying your feelings, softening your truth so it won't be rejected. And slowly, in this space, that habit began to loosen its grip, and I started to feel emotions I had numbed myself to: grief for the versions of myself that never felt safe enough to emerge, anger for the times I had been overlooked or misunderstood and convinced myself it didn't matter, and an unexpected tenderness toward myself, because being seen reminded me that I wasn't too much or too complicated. I had just been in environments that didn't know how to hold me, and this realization was both liberating and painful, because it reframed my past. It made me question how many relationships I had maintained, not because they were nourishing, but because they were familiar. How many times I had accepted shallow understanding because it was easier than risking deeper connection, and how often I had abandoned my own needs to avoid discomfort. And with this awareness came fear, because once you know what it feels like to be truly seen, you can't unfeel it, and you start to crave that level of honesty in your life, which means you also start to notice where it's missing, and that noticing can be lonely because it may require you to outgrow spaces, dynamics, and even people that no longer align with who you're becoming. And I wrestled with that fear quietly, wondering if allowing myself to be seen would ultimately cost me the safety of being small. But what I learned is that staying unseen is not safety, it's stagnation, and stagnation slowly drains the life out of you, even if everything looks stable on the surface. And this person didn't rescue me from that truth. They simply reflected it back to me by example, by showing me what presence looks like, what it means to listen without preparing a response, to understand without trying to control, to care without conditions. And that reflection forced me to confront my own patterns. the ways I withheld, the ways I deflected intimacy with logic, humor, or ambition. And for the first time, I asked myself whether I was actually protecting my peace or just avoiding vulnerability. And that question stayed with me, echoing in moments of silence, because vulnerability is not dramatic or loud, it's quiet. It's the willingness to let someone witness you without knowing how they'll respond. And that willingness felt terrifying precisely because it mattered. And as I slowly allowed more of myself to surface, I noticed something unexpected. The fear of being seen was closely tied to the fear of being valued for who I am rather than what I do. Because if someone sees you clearly and still chooses you, then you can no longer tell yourself that your worth depends on constant achievement or usefulness. And that belief had been a pillar of my identity for so long that letting go of it felt like stepping into unknown territory. But with that unknown came relief, because I was red of earning my place everywhere I went, tired of proving that I deserved space, tired of feeling replaceable. And this person, without saying it directly, showed me that connection doesn't have to be transactional, that presence itself can be enough. And that realization began to change how I moved through the world, how I listened to others, how I spoke about myself, how I recognized the quiet ways people asked to be understood. And it made me wonder how many people around me were carrying the same unseen weight, how many were hoping, consciously or not, for someone to notice them beyond their surface. And in that awareness, I found both humility and responsibility, because being seen taught me the value of seeing others, not as roles, not as functions, not as narratives I've already written in my head, but as evolving complex human beings. And as I stood in that growing understanding, I realized that the person who truly sees me didn't just change how I felt about myself, they changed how I understood connection itself. And that understanding was only the beginning. As this awareness deepened, I began to understand that being seen is not a moment but a process, something that unfolds slowly as trust replaces defense. And with that understanding came a new kind of vulnerability, one that wasn't about revealing secrets or confessing pain, but about allowing my reactions, doubts, and imperfections to exist without immediate correction. And this was harder than I expected, because I had spent years refining my ability to stay composed, to respond thoughtfully rather than honestly, to filter my emotions so they would arrive in acceptable forms. And now, in the presence of someone who truly saw me, those filters felt unnecessary yet deeply ingrained. And there were moments when I caught myself retreating out of habit, minimizing my feelings, intellectualizing my experiences, or redirecting conversations away from anything that felt too raw, not because this person made me feel unsafe, but because safety itself was unfamiliar, and unfamiliar safety can feel like standing on ground that looks solid but still makes you hesitate. And I realized that much of my discomfort came from an old belief that if people saw the full complexity of me, the contradictions, the uncertainties, the emotional fluctuations, they would eventually pull away. And that belief had been reinforced quietly over time through small dismissals, misunderstandings, and moments where I learned that certain parts of me were better kept hidden. And unlearning that belief required patience, not just from this person, but from myself, because healing doesn't happen when someone suddenly understands you. It happens when you slowly allow that understanding to challenge the stories you've told yourself for years. And as those stories began to loosen, I started noticing how often I had mistaken intensity for depth, how I had equated emotional distance with strength, and how I had undervalued consistency, presence, and quiet care, because the world teaches us to chase dramatic connections, loud affirmations, and visible validation, while overlooking the subtle power of someone who notices your patterns, remembers your silences, and respects your pace. And this person did exactly that. They noticed when I withdrew without asking invasive questions. They gave space without disappearing. They stayed curious rather than offended. And in doing so, they showed me that real understanding doesn't demand immediate access. It earns it over time. And this shifted how I related not only to them, but to myself, because I began to pay attention to my own inner signals, the moments when I felt overwhelmed but pushed through anyway, the times I dismissed my intuition because logic felt safer, the ways I ignored my emotional needs in favor of productivity. And being seen made those patterns harder to ignore, because once someone reflects your inner world back to you with clarity, self-neglect becomes more visible. And visibility brings responsibility, and that responsibility was uncomfortable because it meant I could no longer hide behind the narrative that no one understands me as an excuse to avoid deeper self-honesty. And instead, I had to ask myself what it would look like to understand myself with the same patience and curiosity this person showed me. And that question lingered, reshaping my internal dialogue, softening the harshness with which I judged my own emotions, and slowly, I began to allow myself to feel things fully without immediately categorizing them as weaknesses or distractions, and this emotional permission created space for grief I hadn't processed, for disappointment I had rationalized away, for desires I had suppressed because they didn't align with who I thought I needed to be. And none of this was dramatic or sudden. It was quiet, almost subtle, but profound, like realizing you've been holding your breath for years and only now learning how to exhale. And what struck me most was that this person didn't try to guide or direct this process. They didn't claim credit for my growth. They simply remained consistent. And consistency has a way of revealing truth because it shows you that understanding isn't a conditional on your performance, your mood, or your usefulness. And that realization challenged a core belief I had carried for a long time. That connection must be earned continuously to be maintained, and letting go of that belief felt like stepping out of a constant state of evaluation, where I was always measuring my worth through outcomes, contributions, or resilience, and instead learning to exist without justification. And as I practiced this, I noticed how much more present I became, how conversations felt less strategic and more genuine, how I listened not just to respond but to understand, and how I started to recognize when others were masking themselves in the same ways I once did, and this recognition didn't make me judgmental. It made me compassionate because being seen had taught me how much effort it takes to remain unseen, and how lonely that effort can be. And there were moments when fear resurfaced, when I wondered what would happen if this understanding disappeared, if this person left, if this sense of being seen was temporary. And those fears were real, but they no longer felt paralyzing because I realized that even if this connection changed or ended, something irreversible had already happened within me. I had experienced what it felt like to be fully recognized, and that experience had recalibrated my standards for connection, for self-respect, for emotional honesty. And once your standards change, you can't unknow them. You can't go back to convincing yourself that surface level understanding is enough. And that realization was both empowering and sobering, because it meant my life moving forward would require more discernment, more courage, and more willingness to walk away from spaces where I felt invisible. And as I sat with this awareness, I understood that the person who truly sees me didn't complete me or define me. They reminded me of parts of myself I had forgotten, parts that were always there but waiting for permission to exist. And in that reminder, I began to understand that being seen is not about being chosen by someone else. It's about choosing not to abandon yourself when someone finally notices who you are. And that understanding marked a turning point, not just in how I connected with others, but in how I stood with myself, quietly, honestly, and without apology. What followed was a gradual reshaping of how I understood intimacy, not the romanticized version built on intensity and constant reassurance, but a quieter, steadier form rooted in mutual recognition. And this shift didn't arrive with certainty or clarity. It arrived with questions, because when you've lived a long time without being truly seen, you unconsciously build your life around self-containment. You learn how to carry everything alone, how to be your own witness, your own validator, your own anchor. And while that strength looks admirable from the outside, it often hides a deep fatigue that no one notices because you've trained yourself not to show it. And as I began to allow myself to be seen, that fatigue surfaced not as weakness but as truth. And I had to confront the reality that I didn't actually want to do everything alone anymore, that independence had quietly turned into isolation. And that realization felt dangerous because wanting connection means accepting uncertainty. It means acknowledging that loss is possible, that disappointment is possible, that someone else's presence can matter enough to hurt. And for someone who had spent years minimizing their needs, this felt like stepping into emotional exposure without armor. And yet, strangely, it didn't feel reckless. It felt honest, because honesty has a way of stripping away illusions. And the illusion I had lived under was that I was unaffected by being unseen, that I didn't need deeper understanding, that surface-level connection was enough. And seeing that illusion dissolve, was unsettling but freeing because it allowed me to stop pretending that my emotional needs were optional. And as I stopped pretending, I began to notice how often I had chosen distance over discomfort, how many times I had stayed silent instead of risking misinterpretation, how many opportunities for deeper connection I had bypassed because they required vulnerability, and being seen made those patterns visible, not to shame me, but to show me how deeply I had internalized the idea that my inner world was something to manage privately rather than share. And this awareness extended beyond my relationship with this person into every area of my life. How I showed up in conversations, how I responded to conflict, how quickly I retreated when things became emotionally complex, and with this awareness came choice. Because once you see a pattern clearly, you can no longer claim ignorance. And I began to experiment with staying present a little longer, with expressing uncertainty instead of masking it with confidence, with allowing pauses instead of rushing to resolution, and these small shifts felt significant because they went against years of conditioning. And what surprised me was how often people responded positively, how many moments of genuine connection emerged when I stopped performing understanding and allowed myself to be in the process of it. And still, there were moments of fear, moments when I questioned whether this openness would cost me respect, whether being seen too clearly would make me easier to dismiss, because the fear of being reduced or misunderstood doesn't disappear just because you've been seen once. It lingers, shaped by memory and experience. And yet, this person continued to meet me with the same steadiness, not reacting dramatically to my emotions, not withdrawing when things became uncomfortable, not trying to control the narrative. And that consistency slowly rewired something in me, because consistency creates safety, not through reassurance, but through reliability. And reliability teaches you that understanding doesn't vanish the moment you're inconvenient. And this lesson was profound because it challenged the belief that I had to constantly regulate myself to maintain connection. And as that belief loosened, I felt myself relax into authenticity in ways I hadn't before, not because I felt fearless, but because fear no longer dictated my every move. And in that space, I began to reflect on how many people in my past had seen only parts of me, fragments shaped by circumstance, performance, or necessity, and how I had accepted that partial recognition as full understanding because I didn't know what else was possible. And now that I did, I couldn't unsee the difference, and this difference reshaped my boundaries, not as walls, but as filters. B. Because being seen taught me that not everyone earns access to your inner world, that depth should be met with depth, that vulnerability without reciprocity becomes self-erasure. And this discernment felt empowering rather than isolating, because it allowed me to choose connection intentionally rather than out of habit or fear. And as I grew more selective, I also grew more compassionate, because I recognized that many people are doing the best they can with the emotional tools they have, and their inability to see deeply is often not malicious but unpracticed. And this understanding softened my resentment toward past misunderstandings, allowing me to release some of the quiet bitterness I hadn't realized I was carrying. And still, the most significant shift was internal, because I stopped waiting to be fully understood before allowing myself to exist authentically. I stopped shrinking preemptively, stopped translating myself into something more acceptable. And this internal alignment created a sense of wholeness that didn't depend entirely on external recognition. And yet, it was undeniably shaped by the experience of being seen, because being seen showed me what alignment feels like, what emotional congruence feels like, and once you know that feeling, you begin to seek it within yourself as well. And as I stood in this evolving sense of self, I understood that the person who truly sees me didn't give me something I lacked. They mirrored something I'd forgotten how to see. And in that mirroring, I reclaimed a part of myself that had been waiting patiently beneath layers of adaptation. And this reclamation marked a quiet but decisive shift, because I was no longer just reacting to how others perceived me. I was responding to how I understood myself. And that understanding felt like the foundation for something new, something more honest, something more grounded. And as I moved forward that foundation, I knew that whatever came next would be shaped not by the fear of being unseen, but by the clarity of having been truly seen. And that clarity changed everything. By the time I reached this point, I understood that being seen is not something that happens to you once and then stays forever. It is something that must be allowed, protected, and practiced. And this realization shifted my focus inward. Because while this person had shown me what it felt like to be truly understood, the deeper work was learning how not to disappear when that understanding wasn't immediately present. And this was perhaps the most difficult lesson of all, because it required me to confront the parts of myself that still equated worth with external recognition, that still looked outward for confirmation that I was enough, and being seen had exposed those dependencies with clarity, not to shame me, but to show me where my sense of self was still fragile. And I began to notice how quickly I adjusted myself in unfamiliar spaces, how I softened my opinions, edited my emotions, or leaned into productivity as a way of earning belonging. And awareness alone didn't immediately change these habits, but it gave me the choice to pause, to ask myself whether I was responding from authenticity or from fear. And those pauses, though small, became powerful because they interrupted years of automatic behavior. And as I practiced staying present in my own experience, even when it felt uncomfortable, I discovered that self-abandonment often happens quietly, not through dramatic compromise, but through subtle misalignments, through saying yes when you mean no, through minimizing your needs, through laughing off things that hurt. And being seen had made those moments visible, because once someone recognizes your inner world, you become more aware of when you are betraying it, and this awareness created a new standard for how I treated myself, one rooted in respect rather than endurance. And respect, I learned, is not loud or performative. It is expressed through consistency, through honoring your boundaries even when no one is watching, through allowing your emotions to exist without immediately judging or correcting them. And this internal shift changed how I related to the person who saw me as well, because I no longer expected them to hold everything for me, to be my sole witness or anchor, and instead I approached the connection as a shared space rather than a refuge from myself. And this made the bond feel healthier, lighter, and more grounded, because true understanding does not create dependence, it creates capacity, the capacity to show up as yourself across different contexts. And as I embodied this capacity, I began to recognize how rare it is for people to feel fully seen, not because others are incapable, but because many of us are not practiced at letting ourselves be known. We hide behind competence, humor, logic, or independence, and then wonder why we feel disconnected. And this insight deepened my empathy, because I realized that being unseen is often a mutual process, shaped by both our fear of exposure and others' fear of depth. And understanding this helped me release the need to assign blame for past disconnections, replacing it with curiosity about how connection can be cultivated more intentionally. And still, there were moments when the old fear resurfaced, moments when I wondered what would happen if this person stopped seeing me, if life changed, if distance grew. And instead of pushing those fears away, I allowed them to exist. Because being seen had taught me that acknowledging fear does not give it power, it gives it clarity, and clarity reduces its grip. And in that clarity, I recognized that the experience of being seen had already done its work. It had expanded my emotional range, sharpened my self-awareness, and strengthened my ability to remain present even when understanding was uncertain. And that meant that even if this connection evolved or ended, I would not return to the version of myself who believed invisibility was safety. And this realization brought a quiet confidence, not the loud confidence built on certainty or control, but a grounded confidence rooted in self-trust. And self-trust changes everything. It influences how you choose relationships, how you handle conflict, how you respond to misunderstanding. Because when you trust yourself, you don't panic at the thought of being misread. You know who you are even when others don't fully grasp it. And this trust allowed me to engage with the world more openly, to express myself without excessive self-censorship, to accept that not everyone will understand me, and that this is not a failure, but a natural consequence of depth. And depth, I learned, is not meant to be universally accessible. It is meant to be shared with those willing to meet it. And as I moved with this understanding, I noticed a subtle shift in how people responded to me, not because I was trying to be different, but because alignment has a way of clarifying energy, of signaling authenticity. And while not everyone responded positively, the connections that did form felt more genuine, more reciprocal, more nourishing. And this reinforced the lesson that being seen is less about exposure and more about resonance. about finding the spaces where your inner world is met with curiosity rather than resistance. And in this resonance, I found a sense of belonging that didn't require performance. And that sense of belonging extended inward because I began to belong to myself in a way I hadn't before, to stand with my emotions rather than manage them away, to acknowledge my needs without apology, and to recognize that wanting to be seen is not a weakness. It is a reflection of our relational nature as humans. And this acceptance marked a profound internal shift because it replaced shame with understanding, and in that understanding, I felt a quiet gratitude, not just for the person who saw me, but for the version of myself who finally allowed it, because allowing yourself to be seen requires courage, and courage often goes unnoticed because it doesn't announce itself. It simply changes the way you live. And as I stood in that change, I understood that being truly seen once can teach you how to see yourself forever, and that lesson, once learned, becomes a part of you, shaping every connection that follows. In the end, what stayed with me most was not the person themselves, but the transformation their presence initiated, because being truly seen leaves an imprint that reshapes how you move through the world long after the moment has passed. And I realized that the deepest gift of being seen is not validation but orientation. It helps you locate yourself more clearly within your own life, and with that clarity comes a quiet responsibility to live in alignment with what you now know about yourself. And this alignment is not dramatic or perfect. It is practiced in ordinary moments, in how you respond to misunderstanding without immediately shrinking, in how you speak your truth without rehearsing it into something safer, in how you allow complexity to exist without rushing to resolution. And as I practiced this, I noticed how much less energy I spent managing perception, how much lighter I felt without the constant internal negotiation of who I needed to be in each space. And this lightness was not the absence of struggle, but the absence of unnecessary self-betrayal. And that distinction mattered because struggle is part of growth, but self-betrayal is optional. And being seen had taught me how to recognize the different. And with that recognition, I began to approach relationships differently, not as places to prove my worth or secure my identity, but as spaces of mutual witnessing, where both people are allowed to be unfinished, evolving, and human. And this shift changed the way I listened, because I no longer listened to confirm my own value. I listened to understand, and understanding became less about agreement and more about presence. And presence, I learned, is the rarest form of generosity because it requires you to set aside your assumptions, your defenses, your need to control outcomes, and simply meet what is in front of you. And as I practiced presence with others, I noticed that I was also becoming more present with myself, more attentive to my inner responses, more respectful of my limits, and more patient with my process. And patience had never come easily to me, because I had spent so much of my life moving forward through discipline and endurance, and now I was learning how to move through self-compassion. And this didn't make me passive or complacent. It made me honest, because honesty requires you to acknowledge when you are tired, when you are unsure, when you need rest, and acknowledging these things does not weaken your path, it sustains it. And as I integrated this understanding, I began to see how often people equate being strong with being unshakable, when in reality, strength is the ability to remain connected to yourself through change, through loss, through uncertainty. And being seen had shown me that connection is not something you wait for others to provide. It is something you cultivate within yourself and then share. And this internal connection became a source of stability, especially in moments when external understanding was absent, because I no longer felt erased by misunderstanding. I felt anchored by self-recognition. And this anchoring allowed me to take emotional risks without losing myself, to engage deeply without dissolving into someone else's expectations, and to walk away from spaces where I felt unseen without bitterness or blame. And this emotional autonomy was perhaps the most profound outcome of being truly seen, because it meant that my sense of self was no longer entirely relational. It was rooted, and rootedness creates freedom, the freedom to choose connection rather than cling to it, the freedom to express rather than perform, the freedom to be misunderstood without internal collapse. And as I lived with this freedom, I began to understand that the person who truly sees you is not meant to carry you or complete you. They are meant to remind you of your own visibility, to reflect back the parts of you that have always existed but were waiting for acknowledgement. And in that reflection, you are given a choice to return to old patterns of self-concealment, or to step forward with greater integrity. And choosing integrity does not mean you will always be understood, but it means you will be aligned and align me. NT is a form of peace that does not depend on circumstance. And as I chose it again and again, imperfectly but intentionally, I noticed how my life began to organize itself differently, how my decisions felt less reactive, how my boundaries felt less defensive, how my relationships felt more reciprocal, and how my inner dialogue softened, replacing self-criticism with curiosity. And this softening allowed me to meet my own humanity with grace, which in turn allowed me to meet others with greater empathy. And in this way, the experience of being seen rippled outward, shaping not just one connection, but many. And as I reflect on this journey, I understand now that being truly seen is not a destination, it is a doorway. And once you walk through it, you cannot return to the life you lived before, not because it was wrong, but because you now know what is possible. And knowing what is possible changes how you tolerate invisibility, both from others and from yourself. And this is where the story settles, not with certainty, not with final answers, but with a deeper sense of self-recognition. And in that recognition, I carry the quiet knowledge that even if no one else ever sees me in the same way again, I have learned how to remain visible to myself, and that ultimately is the most enduring form of being truly seen.